You think you know about the luxurious life of Chinese imperial harems? Hollywood and period dramas have painted you a picture of elegant women in silk robes, gracefully competing for an emperor's love in perfumed gardens. But the truth behind the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City is so horrifying that Chinese historians have spent centuries burying it under layers of romanticized propaganda. What really happened in those sealed chambers was not romance. It was systematic psychological warfare that transformed thousands of women into prisoners of the world's most sophisticated torture machine disguised as paradise. What if I told you that those graceful concubines were actually victims of history's most brutal human trafficking operation? That girls as young as 12 were kidnapped from their families, never to be seen again, and forced into a system where suicide became a rational career choice? That the Forbidden City wasn't a palace of pleasure, but a carefully designed psychological laboratory where women's minds were systematically broken, their bodies turned into breeding machines, and their children used as weapons in political games that claimed thousands of innocent lives. The secrets locked away in classified Chinese archives will shatter everything you thought you knew about imperial China. You'll discover how concubines use poison, black magic, and sexual manipulation to climb a hierarchy built on human suffering. How some women gain power that secretly controlled entire dynasties, while others died forgotten in underground torture chambers, their screams echoing through centuries of silence. How the harem system created monsters both male and female, and how its legacy of control, surveillance, and psychological manipulation still shapes modern China in ways that will shock you. Tonight, we'll unlock the forbidden vaults of Chinese imperial history and expose the truth about a system so evil that its full documentation remains classified even today. You'll meet women who became serial killers to survive, emperors who ordered mass executions over sexual jealousy, and children born into a world where their first breath might be their last. This isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for understanding how power corrupts absolutely, and why the ghosts of these tortured women still haunt the corridors of modern Chinese politics. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what you think is the most shocking aspect of using women as political weapons, because what we're about to reveal proves that the real Game of Thrones happened centuries ago in China, and its body count was far higher than any fiction could imagine. The imperial Chinese harem system emerged during the Qin dynasty in 221 BC and evolved over 2 millennia into the most sophisticated apparatus of female subjugation in human civilization. By the height of the Ming and Qing dynasties, the Forbidden City contained between 3,000 and 40,000 women at any given time, creating what modern historians now recognize as the largest prison complex exclusively designed for women in world history. This wasn't merely a residential arrangement for the emperor's wives. It was a meticulously engineered system of reproductive control designed to extract maximum political value from women while ensuring their complete psychological submission to imperial authority. The architectural design of the harem quarters reveals the prison-like nature of this institution. The inner palace occupied the northern section of the Forbidden City, surrounded by walls within walls, creating a labyrinth from which no woman could escape. Guard towers positioned at strategic intervals allowed eunuchs to monitor every courtyard, every corridor, every private chamber where the concubines lived their entire adult lives. The single entrance to this female world was controlled by the chief eunuch, who maintained detailed records of every woman's movements, relationships, and even conversations. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the empress, chosen not for love, but as the culmination of political negotiations between powerful clans. Her marriage represented a strategic alliance that could shift the balance of power across the entire empire. Below her stretched 8 distinct ranks of women, from imperial noble consorts down to the lowest serving maids, each level dictating everything from the color of silk they could wear to the quality of rice they received at meals. This rigid caste system created a vertical battlefield where women fought each other rather than challenging the system that oppressed them all. The selection process revealed the industrial nature of this human trafficking operation. Every 3 years, imperial commissioners scoured the empire in a process called shiunu, evaluating unmarried women like livestock at a market. Beauty was only the first criterion. The commissioners examined family backgrounds, measured physical proportions, tested intelligence through interviews, and even consulted fortune tellers to predict fertility and longevity. Young women who met these impossible standards simply disappeared from their villages forever, their families receiving only a ceremonial notification that their daughter now served the dragon throne. Daily life in the harem followed a rigid schedule designed to occupy the women's minds while preventing any meaningful human connections. Mornings began with mandatory beauty rituals that could last 4 hours, elaborate makeup application, hairstyling that required teams of servants, and costume selection that followed complex rules about seasonal colors and imperial preferences. Afternoons were devoted to cultural refinement, painting, poetry, music, and embroidery that would never be seen outside the palace walls. Evenings brought the terrifying possibility of imperial summons, when a woman might be selected for the emperor's pleasure and face the ultimate test of her survival skills. But this orderly facade masked a far more sinister reality. The harem operated as an economic engine where women's bodies generated political capital through pregnancy, where their children became bargaining chips for imperial succession, and where their deaths could be orchestrated as easily as their births. The system promised luxury and status, but delivered isolation, paranoia, and psychological warfare that drove many women to madness or suicide. What appeared to the outside world as a palace of earthly delights was actually a sophisticated machine for converting human suffering into dynastic power. The true horror of the harem system revealed itself in the deliberate psychological techniques employed to control thousands of intelligent, strong-willed women confined in close quarters. The selection process itself was designed to break spirits before the women even arrived at the palace. Girls were torn from their families during their most formative years, stripped of their original names and identities, and forced to compete immediately for the most basic necessities of life. This traumatic introduction created a foundation of desperation that the system then exploited ruthlessly. The ranking system transformed natural female relationships into weapons of mutual destruction. Lower-ranking concubines might spend decades without ever meeting the emperor, slowly descending into madness while watching rivals advance through pregnancy or imperial favor. The palace deliberately fostered rumors about imperial preferences, sometimes spreading false information about which women the emperor favored just to trigger conflicts between concubines. Women who should have been natural allies against their oppression instead became each other's deadliest enemies. The sexual politics were perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of harem life. When the emperor decided to visit a concubine, she underwent humiliating preparation rituals that reduced her to a sexual object. Eunuchs bathed her, examined her body for weapons or poison, and escorted her to the imperial bedchamber like a condemned prisoner walking to execution. The encounter itself was often witnessed by eunuchs who recorded details for official records, ensuring that even the most intimate moments remained under state surveillance. Pregnancy became both salvation and death sentence in this twisted environment. A woman carrying the emperor's child gained temporary protection and elevated status, but also became the primary target for every other woman's jealousy and fear. Rival concubines would resort to increasingly desperate measures to eliminate pregnant competitors, poisoning their food with substances that cause miscarriages, bribing servants to cause accidents that resulted in fatal falls, or employing court magicians to cast spells designed to harm unborn children. The children born into this environment faced horrors that modern child psychologists can barely comprehend. Imperial sons became prizes to be controlled by their mothers, who understood that their own survival depended entirely on their child's political prospects. These boys grew up watching their mothers engage in deadly conspiracies, learning that love was weakness and that human relationships existed only to serve political goals. Imperial daughters faced an even worse fate. They were essentially worthless, except as future bargaining chips in diplomatic marriages, leading many to be neglected or deliberately harmed by concubines who saw them as competition for limited imperial attention. The eunuch system created another layer of psychological horror within the harem. These castrated men, themselves victims of the imperial system, often became the most vicious enforcers of harem discipline. Having sacrificed their own sexuality for access to power, many eunuchs developed sadistic relationships with the women under their control. They could enter areas forbidden to other men, witness the women's most private moments, and exercise life or death authority over beings who possessed what they had lost forever. This created a dynamic of mutual hatred and dependence that poisoned every human interaction within the palace walls. The surveillance system within the harem would make modern totalitarian states envious. Every servant was a potential informant. Every conversation could be reported to higher authorities, and every friendship might be a trap set by rivals. Women developed elaborate codes for communicating dangerous information, employed food tasters to avoid poisoning, and slept with weapons hidden beneath their silk pillows. The constant paranoia transformed even the most innocent activities into potential acts of espionage or rebellion. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of harem life was the complete absence of hope for escape or change. Unlike prisoners who might serve fixed sentences or slaves who could dream of freedom, concubines understood that they would die within those walls regardless of their behavior. The only question was whether death would come through natural causes, suicide, murder by rivals, or execution for real or imagined offenses against imperial dignity. This hopelessness created a psychological environment where normal moral constraints dissolved, and women were willing to commit any atrocity if it offered even temporary improvement in their circumstances. Among the thousands of women who disappeared into this nightmare system, one story illuminates both the heights of ambition and the depths of moral corruption that the harem environment produced. Wu Zetian began her imperial career as a 13-year-old concubine selected for Emperor Taizong's harem in 638 AD, but through a combination of ruthless intelligence, sexual manipulation, and systematic murder, she eventually became the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her rise to power reads like a masterclass in political survival, but the methods she employed reveal the true psychological cost of the harem system. Wu Zetian's early years in the imperial palace demonstrated the brutal education that harem life provided to intelligent women. Arriving as a frightened child from a minor noble family, She quickly learned that survival depended on making herself indispensable while eliminating competitors. Her first stroke of genius was recognizing that Emperor Taizong, despite his dozens of concubines, was actually starved for intellectual companionship. While other women competed through beauty and sexual skills, Wu offered him something far rarer: genuine conversation with someone who had studied history, philosophy, and poetry. This intellectual seduction worked brilliantly, but Wu understood that emotional connections with emperors could be fleeting. She began building a network of allies among the palace eunuchs, offering them information about other concubines' activities in exchange for protection and advancement. Her most crucial relationship was with the chief eunuch, who controlled access to the emperor and could arrange coincidental encounters that appeared spontaneous but were actually carefully orchestrated political theater. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 AD, Wu faced the standard fate of imperial concubines. She was expected to retire to a Buddhist convent and spend the rest of her life in prayer for the deceased emperor's soul. But Wu had already identified her next target, Prince Li Ji, who would become Emperor Gaozong. During the mourning period, when she was technically forbidden from any contact with men, Wu arranged secret meetings with the future emperor and employed every psychological and sexual technique she had learned to ensure his obsession with her. Her seduction of Emperor Gaozong represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of sexual politics in Chinese history. Wu understood that the prince had grown up surrounded by submissive women who offered him no intellectual challenge. She deliberately presented herself as his intellectual equal while maintaining enough feminine vulnerability to trigger his protective instincts. Their secret relationship during the mourning period created a forbidden romance narrative that made her irresistible to a man who had been raised on tales of legendary love affairs. When Gaozong became emperor and recalled Wu from the convent to become his concubine, she had already begun planning the systematic elimination of every obstacle to ultimate power. Her first targets were the existing empress and the emperor's favorite concubine, both of whom stood between her and imperial favor. Wu's methods revealed the sophisticated understanding of palace psychology that years of harem warfare had taught her. The destruction of Empress Wang demonstrates Wu's mastery of psychological manipulation. Rather than attacking the empress directly, Wu began a campaign of subtle sabotage designed to make Wang appear paranoid and unstable. She arranged for the empress to discover evidence of various conspiracies that didn't actually exist, leading Wang to make accusations that made her seem delusional. Simultaneously, Wu presented herself as the emperor's calm, rational confidant who could help him navigate these imaginary crises that she herself had created. But Wu's most horrifying act was the murder of her own infant daughter, which she then blamed on Empress Wang to complete her rival's destruction. When the emperor discovered the dead child, Wu's performance of grief was so convincing that he never questioned her accusations against the empress. This infanticide eliminated both a potential rival for imperial affection and the woman who stood between Wu and the empress position. The psychological sophistication required to murder her own child and use the act as a political weapon reveals how completely the harem system had corrupted even maternal instincts. Once she became Empress Wu, her campaign of terror against rivals and perceived threats expanded into systematic genocide that claimed thousands of lives over several decades. She created her own secret police force, staffed primarily by men from humble backgrounds who owed their positions entirely to her patronage. These agents infiltrated every level of imperial administration, reporting on conversations, relationships, and even private thoughts that might indicate disloyalty to her regime. Wu's understanding of mass psychology allowed her to manipulate an entire empire through carefully orchestrated campaigns of fear and propaganda. She encouraged citizens to report on each other's activities, creating a surveillance state that extended far beyond the palace walls. Her agents spread rumors about supernatural omens that supported her right to rule, while simultaneously eliminating scholars and officials who possessed the historical knowledge that might challenge her unprecedented claims to imperial authority. The massacre that secured Wu's position as sole ruler reveals the true extent of her moral transformation. In 684 AD, when faced with a rebellion led by her own stepsons, she ordered the systematic execution of every member of the Li royal family who might serve as an alternative focus for imperial loyalty. This included children, elderly relatives, and distant cousins who posed no realistic threat to her power. The purge eliminated over 3,000 people in a single month, creating a power vacuum that she filled with her own relatives and supporters. But perhaps Wu's greatest achievement was her manipulation of Chinese imperial ideology to legitimize female rule in a system that had excluded women from political power for over 8 centuries. She commissioned scholars to fabricate historical precedents for female emperors, created new religious doctrines that portrayed her as the earthly manifestation of the Buddhist deity Maitreya, and systematically rewrote Chinese historical records to support her legitimacy. This propaganda campaign was so effective that even today, many Chinese historians struggle to separate the myths Wu created about herself from the documented facts of her reign. Wu's reign as emperor lasted 15 years, during which she demonstrated administrative competence that even her harshest critics could not deny. She expanded the imperial examination system to allow men from humble backgrounds to serve in government, created new agricultural policies that increased food production, and maintained relative peace along China's borders through skillful diplomacy. But these achievements came at the cost of transforming Chinese political culture into a surveillance state where paranoia and betrayal became standard operating procedures. The personal cost of Wu's success reveals the ultimate tragedy of the harem system. Despite achieving unprecedented power, she lived in constant fear of assassination or rebellion, trusting no one, and surrounded by the same atmosphere of terror that she had experienced as a young concubine. Her relationships with her own children were poisoned by political calculations. She murdered one son who challenged her authority, exiled another who showed too much independence, and used her remaining children as political tools rather than objects of maternal love. Wu's later years demonstrate how the harem system's psychological damage could never be fully healed, even by ultimate victory. As she aged and her grip on power weakened, she became increasingly paranoid and cruel, ordering executions based on dreams and omens rather than evidence. The woman who had once been celebrated for her intelligence and political skill descended into the same pattern of arbitrary violence that had characterized so many of her imperial predecessors. The final act of Wu's story came in 705 AD, when a palace coup led by her own ministers forced her to abdicate in favor of her son. The irony was complete. The woman who had spent decades eliminating rivals and consolidating power was ultimately destroyed by the same palace intrigues she had mastered. Her death shortly after abdication marked the end of the only successful female challenge to China's male-dominated imperial system, but also demonstrated the futility of trying to reform the system from within rather than destroying it entirely. The Guangxu Emperor's reign from 1875 to 1908 marked the final crescendo of harem horror as the Qing dynasty collapsed into chaos, and the ancient system of imperial concubinage revealed its ultimate capacity for mass destruction. What began as a succession crisis, triggered by the previous emperor's death without a clear heir, evolved into a bloodbath that claimed over 50,000 lives and demonstrated how the psychological warfare techniques perfected in the harem could be scaled up to destroy an entire civilization. The crisis began when Empress Dowager Cixi, herself a former concubine who had manipulated her way to unprecedented power, selected her 3-year-old nephew Guangxu as emperor while maintaining actual control as regent. This decision created a power vacuum that rival court factions immediately moved to exploit, leading to a decade-long struggle where children were used as weapons, women orchestrated mass murders, and the distinction between political opposition and personal vendetta completely disappeared. Cixi's background reveals how the harem system had evolved by the 19th century into a machine for creating female monsters. Born Yehanara Lanner in 1835, she entered the Forbidden City at age 16 as one of Emperor Xianfeng's concubines. Her rise to power followed the classic pattern of harem advancement. She became pregnant with the emperor's only son, then used her position as mother of the heir to gradually eliminate rivals and accumulate political influence. But Cixi's ambitions extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of feminine power. When Emperor Xianfeng died in 1861, leaving 5-year-old Tongji as heir, Cixi orchestrated a coup that eliminated the Regency Council appointed to govern during the child's minority. Her methods revealed the sophisticated understanding of mass psychology that decades of harem warfare had taught her. Rather than attacking her enemies directly, she created a crisis of legitimacy by spreading rumors that the regents planned to murder the child emperor and install a puppet ruler from a different branch of the imperial family. The massacre of the Sushan faction demonstrates how harem political techniques could be adapted for large-scale violence. Cixi accused the 8 regents of treason, then had them arrested during a ceremony honoring the dead emperor. 3 were executed immediately, while the others faced prolonged torture designed to extract confessions that implicated hundreds of their supporters. The resulting purge eliminated over 2,000 court officials and established Cixi as the true power behind the throne. But Cixi's greatest innovation was her use of the harem women themselves as agents of political terror. She transformed the concubines from passive victims into active participants in espionage and assassination, creating networks of female agents who could penetrate areas of the palace forbidden to male spies. These women, desperate for protection in an increasingly violent environment, competed to prove their loyalty by reporting on each other's activities and eliminating perceived threats to Cixi's authority. The psychological techniques Cixi employed to control both the imperial court and the harem revealed the sophisticated understanding of human nature that the concubine system had developed over centuries. She created elaborate systems of rewards and punishments that made loyalty profitable while making opposition literally deadly. Women who provided useful intelligence received better food, more luxurious quarters, and protection for their families, while those suspected of disloyalty simply disappeared during the night. The reign of terror that Cixi unleashed during the 1870s transformed the Forbidden City into a concentration camp where survival depended entirely on the ability to anticipate and serve her paranoid whims. She ordered the execution of pregnant concubines whose children might threaten her control, had servants beaten to death for minor protocol violations, and created an atmosphere where court officials competed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly sadistic proposals for eliminating perceived enemies. The Guangxu Emperor's attempted reforms in 1898 triggered Cixi's most horrific response to challenges to her authority. When the young emperor, now 27 years old, tried to implement political reforms that would have modernized China's government and military, Cixi interpreted this as a personal betrayal by the nephew she had raised to serve her interests. Her response was to orchestrate what historians now call the 100 Days Massacre, a systematic elimination of everyone connected to the reform movement. The violence began with the arrest and execution of 6 reform leaders, but Cixi's paranoia quickly expanded the target list to include thousands of scholars, officials, and intellectuals who had supported modernization efforts. The methods employed revealed the influence of harem torture techniques on imperial justice. Victims were subjected to prolonged interrogation designed to break their minds rather than extract information, then executed in ways calculated to terrorize potential supporters. But Cixi's most psychologically devastating act was her treatment of Emperor Guangxu himself. Rather than executing him, which might have created a martyr, she chose to keep him alive as a broken symbol of what happened to those who challenged her authority. The emperor was confined to a small island in the imperial lake, where he lived under constant surveillance, forbidden to speak with anyone except approved servants, and forced to watch as his supporters were systematically destroyed. The final phase of Cixi's reign, from 1900 to 1908, demonstrated how the harem system's psychological damage could extend beyond individual victims to corrupt an entire civilization. As foreign powers carved up Chinese territory and internal rebellions threatened the dynasty's survival, Cixi responded with increasingly irrational policies that accelerated the empire's collapse. Her decision to support the Boxer Rebellion against foreign influence led to the occupation of Beijing by international forces and the humiliating treaty obligations that bankrupted the imperial treasury. The deaths of both Cixi and Emperor Guangxu in November 1908, occurring within one day of each other, marked the effective end of the imperial system that had oppressed Chinese women for over 2 millennia. Modern forensic analysis of Guangxu's remains has revealed lethal levels of arsenic, confirming that Cixi had him poisoned to prevent any posthumous vindication of his reform efforts. Her final act of murder demonstrated that even facing death, she could not abandon the paranoid psychology that the harem system had instilled in her decades earlier. The legacy of the Chinese imperial harem system extends far beyond its official abolition in 1912, creating cultural and political patterns that continue to influence modern China in ways that are rarely acknowledged or openly discussed. For over 2 millennia, Chinese society was shaped by an institution that systematically dehumanized women, normalized psychological warfare, and created power structures based on surveillance, betrayal, and reproductive control. The psychological damage inflicted by this system on Chinese civilization runs so deep that its effects can still be observed in contemporary social behavior, political culture, and gender relations. The harem surveillance culture established precedents for state monitoring of private life that resonate powerfully in modern China's digital authoritarianism. The Eastern Depot's network of informants, the systematic recording of personal conversations, and the assumption that privacy was a privilege that could be revoked at will created cultural templates for accepting government intrusion into intimate relationships. Modern Chinese citizens often display a reflexive acceptance of social credit systems, facial recognition monitoring, and digital tracking that historians trace directly to cultural memories of harem-style surveillance. The economic model pioneered by the harem system, where human relationships serve state interests and personal autonomy, was sacrificed for collective stability, established patterns that persist in modern Chinese approaches to individual rights and family planning. The concept that personal reproductive choices should be managed by central authorities, that marriage decisions should serve broader political goals, and that children belong to the state rather than their parents, all echo the harem system's fundamental assumptions about the relationship between individuals and political power. Perhaps most tragically, the harem system's psychological warfare techniques became embedded in Chinese culture's approach to female competition and cooperation. The paranoia, backstabbing, and zero-sum thinking that the imperial concubine system deliberately fostered among women created cultural patterns where female solidarity was seen as dangerous and female competition was normalized as natural. These patterns persist in modern Chinese workplaces, educational institutions, and social networks where women often find themselves recreating harem-style dynamics without understanding their historical origins. The secret archives of the Forbidden City, many of which remain classified even today under the current Chinese government, are believed to contain documentation of harem practices so disturbing that full disclosure might destabilize modern Chinese society. Historians who have gained limited access to these materials report evidence of systematic sexual abuse, medical experimentation on pregnant concubines, and psychological torture techniques that were later adopted by 20th century intelligence agencies. The full extent of what occurred behind those vermilion walls may never be publicly revealed, as the Chinese Communist Party recognizes that these historical horrors could undermine the legitimacy of any system that claims to represent Chinese civilization. Archaeological evidence from recent excavations within the Forbidden City has uncovered physical proof that confirms the most horrific accounts from censored historical documents. Burial sites containing hundreds of female skeletons showing signs of violent death, hidden chambers designed for imprisonment and torture, and architectural features specifically created to muffle screams all verify that the romanticized version of harem life was a deliberate fiction created to hide systematic atrocities that continued for centuries. The international implications of the harem system's legacy extend far beyond China's borders, as the People's Republic assumes an increasingly dominant role in global affairs. China's historical patterns of treating individuals as state resources, normalizing surveillance of private life, and subordinating personal autonomy to collective goals are being exported through economic partnerships, educational exchanges, and political alliances that recreate traditional Chinese power dynamics on a global scale. Understanding the harem system's role in creating these patterns becomes crucial for anyone seeking to understand why modern Chinese behavior often seems inexplicably authoritarian to observers from cultures with different historical experiences. The women who suffered and died in these harems left no individual monuments, wrote no memoirs that survived imperial censorship, and have no graves that can be visited by those who would honor their memory. Their stories were deliberately erased from official histories, their achievements were attributed to male relatives or ignored entirely, and their sufferings were minimized as necessary sacrifices for imperial glory and dynastic stability. But their legacy lives on in the cultural DNA of a civilization that was shaped by their pain, and perhaps, by examining their stories honestly, we can begin to understand how systems of oppression perpetuate themselves across centuries, and why the price of freedom requires eternal vigilance against those who would turn other human beings into pawns in their games of power. The harems of imperial China were not historical curiosities or romantic fantasies. They were laboratories for perfecting techniques of human control, psychological manipulation, and systematic oppression that continue to influence authoritarian systems around the world. The women who endured and sometimes transcended this nightmare left us a warning written in blood and tears. That the capacity for evil is not limited by gender, that victims can become victimizers when survival demands it, and that the most beautiful exteriors can hide the most monstrous realities. Their ghosts still walk the corridors of the Forbidden City, and their screams still echo in the silence of those who refuse to acknowledge what really happened behind those walls. The full truth about the Chinese imperial harem system remains buried in classified archives, but enough evidence has emerged to prove that this was not just ancient history. It was a blueprint for understanding how civilizations can commit systematic atrocities while convincing themselves that they represent the pinnacle of human achievement. Subscribe to our channel for more shocking revelations about history's darkest secrets, and comment below on which aspect of these harem horrors you believe deserves the most urgent historical investigation. Because the archives are still being opened, new archaeological evidence continues to emerge, and the full truth about what happened behind the Forbidden City's walls may be even more disturbing than what we've revealed today. The dead deserve to have their stories told, and the living deserve to understand how such systems arise and perpetuate themselves so that we might recognize and resist them when they appear